we're talking about contact lists, but specifically talking about creating filters for creating contact lists, so putting contacts on lists based on filters. Now, if you're not a contacts management user and you think this might not apply to you, collections management and using catalog lists is very similar. So if you understand the principles that we're going to talk about in context of contacts, you're going to easily be able to translate that information over to collections. The big concept we're trying to show here is that we are selecting or querying records that meet criteria that within the record. So we're selecting a contact based on information that's in that contact record. So the first question comes up, what's in the contact record? So if I click on the Contacts button, we're on a record, looks like ID number 3 here for Melissa Potter. We're looking at Melissa's contact record. Now the contact record has all types of fields on it. Some of them, like these over to the right here, are the user-defined fields, field 1, field 2, field 3. It also has things that you'd expect, like address, city, state, and zip. There's an area where down here toward the bottom where you can see all of the contact lists that Melissa Potter is currently on. There's all different types of fields. Some of them are formatted, like the telephone number fields. They have a formatting in there that puts a dash and a / in. There's a place here where it's a formatted field. There's logic fields, things like radio buttons or check boxes. You can see one down here for volunteer. Over to the left in the sidebar is how you get into the other views in PastPerfect's contact record. And the thing I want to point out is that not everything on the contact screen is actually in the contacts database. And in the contacts database, you would not have things like specific donations to a fund. This is where the relational database part comes in. Now we can still use this, and you're going to see me using the endowment fund a little bit later. But notice that these fields, that these records are typically seen in a grid like this. That means that they're usually part of a child or a related table. If I take a look at volunteer, the volunteer tab, there's status up here. There's availability, which all has to do with this Melissa Potter contact record. But all of the information to the right here for each time that she came and volunteered at our museum, each one of those is its own record kept in a different database. I think we'll be able to make that a little bit more clear as we move along. I want to specifically point out that you can select which days Melissa is available to help out at the museum if she is indeed active. If I click on Edit here and I change her from inactive to active, say that she's available only on Saturday, and hit Save, I've made a change to the record, and I have a checkbox or a true in Saturday. So then what fields are available to query on? And the same fields that we can query with in the contacts data table are going to be available to us in the contact lists section of PastPerfect. So if I click on Query here, and then hit the down arrow next to Field, you'll see a list of all of the fields that are available to run your query and therefore run your contact lists from. Including down toward the bottom here, we're going to see those volunteer hours I was just talking about. But then a little further down, you're going to see donations and then a dot, donations period, campaign activity, donations period, amount, donations period, fund. When you see that period in the middle, that means it's going to one of those child tables, like we saw out there with volunteer hours. As I scroll all the way to the bottom here, you should see volunteer hours and date, volunteer hours and notes. The example I'm going to do later was with the, is the donations fund. Okay, so those are all fields that are available for query and therefore available to build contact lists. So what are these fields used for? There's two different ways to know how PastPerfect has designed a field to be used. And I'm going to go back to a simple field here. We all should know how to use the city field. So if I put my cursor inside that city field and hit F1 on my keyboard, it tells me what PastPerfect designed that field to be used for. Now, if you don't want to have to look around the screen to find each one, there's another way to get this information. And that's to go out of the contact screen, go to Reports, and once you're in Reports, go to Field Descriptions. And in Field Descriptions, it gives you complete lists of each of these data tables and what each field in that data table was designed to be used for. If I double-click on the contacts and preview, you get a chance to see that the A list, name A list, has been used for a way for institution to organize. Let me see if I can get all the way over to volunteer, because that is one we will use for our example. So in this case, we have volunteer. It's a person who has the volunteer check marks checked, and it's a logical value. That's logical, true, or false. Also, what days they are available is a logical value, and Vol Sunday is the name of that field. So the field descriptions list tells you what the field was used for, also gives you sort of the official behind-the-scenes name of that field, and shows you its type of field, whether it's logical, memo, character, date, etc. So I'm going to close back out. So that's what the fields were designed to be used for. And part of what makes PastPerfect's reporting a little bit tricky and creating these lists is that once we give it to you and tell you how it was designed to be used, you can use it however you like. If you decided that you didn't want to put everyone's city name in city, but instead wanted to put it in spouse name, you can do that. We don't police you to make sure you don't, but it's going to make it harder to create things like lists, especially if you're inconsistent. It's easy to create a list of people who live in a certain city if I know that all of your records have city in the spouse field. It's very difficult if sometimes it's in spouse field or sometimes it's not. So being consistent is, as always, very important. So we went through the F1 key and the field descriptions. We're going to go into our first example here. The hard part of this process is understanding what to ask the database for, what conditions to set, and how many of those conditions do you need to string together to get the question that you're really trying to ask. And our first example is going to be relatively simple. We want to know all of the people who live, PastPerfect, by the way, is in Exton, Pennsylvania. And so Exton's the thing I'm concerned about. We're looking for all of the people who live in Exton as well. Maybe we want to do a mailing. Maybe we want to invite them to an opening. Who knows? I'm in the Contacts List Manager now, and I'm going to create a new folder. And I'm just going to call it the BG folder. That's my initials. Click on OK. And now I have a new folder. And that folder is empty. So I'm going to create a new list. And this new list is going to be called Exton Residents. I'm not going to bother putting in a description of this. If I was trying to keep my lists organized, I probably should. Once I'm in the Exton Residents, I have the ability to add records to a selected list. If I click on that button, it now brings open a screen that looks very much like our query screen back in the context. If I hit the down arrow field, go down to city, and I'll just leave the begins with there, and Exton, add to statement, and then run query to select results, it finds 11 people that meet my search criteria. All right? So I'm going to add selected records to the list. I'm going to put my 11 people onto this Exton residence list, and then I'm going to go look at it. All right? So I just finished adding those 11 people to the list. Now, if you have a really large database and you're creating really large lists, it has to go through each record individually, so it can take a few minutes. I'm going to click on Exit there, and here's my Exton residence. If I double-click on that, I can view the records on that list. But I don't even have to go that far. I can already see a problem. Look here. I have Extonville, Pennsylvania. Extonville, Pennsylvania is not correct. I just want Exton, Pennsylvania. So how can I deal with that? Well, if I close all the way back out of here and come back to the Exton residence and add records to selected list, the first thing I need to do is clear my list because that list had too many people on it. If I don't remember to do this step, it's not going to automatically clear my Extonville people. So I'm going to remove all records from the list, and then I'm going to click on yes. Now be careful using that button because if you've manually put people on a list instead of using these query features, then you will have to manually put those people back on the list after removing all records from the list, and that can be really problematic. So I'm going to select my filter statement, delete that, and then I'm going to go back and do this again. But this time, instead of doing begins with, I'm going to do contains exact match, and then type in Exton. Add to the statement, and then run query to select to get results. I come up with 10. It took out my Extonville person. So I'm going to add selected records to the list. Are you sure you want to continue? Yes. And I have 10 records on my list. Great. Let's go take a look. So exit out of there, double-click on my Exton residence, and take a look, and I see another problem. Not only is it getting all of the people who are here near our office in Exton, Pennsylvania, it's also getting people in our sister city in Exton, New York. So how can I make it so that it only gives me people who are in Exton, Pennsylvania? And this is where I need to string multiple filter statements together. I need my city to be Exton and my state to be PA, or Pennsylvania. So let's close out of here and do it again. So Exton residence, add records to selected list, remove all records from the list. And this time I don't have to clear my filter. I can just add to my filter. And here comes our question of and or. This statement should be an and statement. That means that both things have to be true in order for the person to be on the list. That means you have to live in Exton and live in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to hit the down arrow here, go down to state, contains exact match, PA, add to statement. And you'll see it puts in city and state. They both match, PA and Exton. Run query. We went from 11, we took out Extonville, and then we had 10, and then we took out the New York, and now we have 8. You can see that number right there. All right, add selected records to a list. Are you sure you want to continue? I'm going to say yes. 8 records added to the list. And I can go view that list. And we now should have our Exton people. All right, so that's our first pretty simple example. It's a creating a filter statement first based on one field and then stringing it together with an and statement. Let's check one thing here before I let you go on to the next example. With the Exton residence, if I'd made a mistake about the and the or, what would have happened? So you can see I have 8 people there now. But what happens if I change that to an or? So I'm going to go to Exton residence, add, and then from here, instead of going and redoing this whole filter statement, I'm going to go in here and modify this filter statement. It's going to look a little bit different, but generally you should be able to see the same syntax here. Okay? There's something about Exton and not empty. The exclamation point is a not empty, contact city. So we're only getting people in Exton. But instead of the and here, I want to make it an or. So I'm going to click on edit and change that to or. Save. Exit. Run records. I'm sorry. Run query to select records. And look what happens. It's not just giving me the people in Exton, Pennsylvania, and Exton, New York. It's also giving me all of the people who live in other cities in Pennsylvania. So That's what the difference between the and or the or. And if you feel like you get a little confused on it, when you have or, you're going to get more results. It means you're going to be less picky about who you're getting. When you do and, more statements have to be true. It's harder to find that one person. Okay? So, excuse me, I'm going to exit out from here. And I did not add those records to the list, so my extant residence stayed the same. But my filter statement is now contained in the PastPerfect database incorrectly. So if I run it again, it's going to mess me up. All right. So that's the extant residence. I have a second example here I want to go through, which is dealing with a volunteer. So my scenario, dealing with volunteers. My scenario here is that I have a big, huge event coming up on Sunday. I need every possible person to help me staff the event that I can possibly get on Sunday. I know that there are some people that are available both Saturday and Sunday. But I need some help on Saturday, just a little bit of help on Saturday, but I know I need lots of help on Sunday. And what I wouldn't want to happen is I wouldn't want one of my Sunday volunteers who would have come in for me to choose to come in on Saturday when they could have come in on Sunday. So the point I'm getting at here is I want to do a very targeted mailing to the volunteers who are not available on Sunday but are available on Saturday. Right? So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to go to my folder, and then I'm going to create a new list. And I'm going to do Saturday, but not Sunday volunteers. All right, again, I could do a description, but I'm going to leave it blank for now. Click on OK, excuse me, OK here. And then I can go to the Saturday, but not Sunday volunteers, and click on the Add Records to Selected List. Brings me to the same screen I was on before, and we need to figure out a few things. Now, the reason I'm using this example is because it's multiple AND statements. There's a lot of things that have to be true here, or a lot of things that have to be verified in order to put a person on this list. And if I scroll down here to about the middle of the list, I'll get to that place where it has my volunteer availability. So my volunteer availability on Saturday must be true. Add that to the statement. And my volunteer availability on Sunday must be false, because I don't want those Sunday volunteers to choose to come in on Saturday. Sorry, I missed the field as I was clicking here. So volunteer hours Sunday, and this case has to be false. Add to statement. Now if I run this, it will give me a number, and I'll show you that number here. It gives me the number of 5. I have 5 people who are able to volunteer on Saturday, but not on Sunday. And those are the people I might want to target. But there could be other things that matter here. For instance, Melissa Potter was not marked as active before. She was marked as inactive. And I wouldn't want to contact a volunteer who clearly told me that they were going to not be available this year or this summer or whatever that would be. And in order to avoid sending this to them accidentally, I'm going to go down and look for volunteer status, begins with, and type in active. Because I manage the volunteers, and I know that when someone's not active and not available to help me out, I change their value to inactive. So I'm going to add that to statement, run query to select results. My number didn't change because all 5 of these volunteers were already active because Melissa Potter, I just changed her to active. All right, so that's a way that we can get multiple AND statements strung together, and. And if we add selected contact records to the list, it will add those 5 contacts to the list, and now we have them to do whatever we're going to do with, whether we're going to set them up to receive a phone call, or send them an email, or send them a letter. All right, so that brings us to a little conversation of logic, and this is the part I said earlier that you might need to have coffee for. But this is what our volunteer example looks like, and I abbreviated it in the on-screen demonstration that I didn't include one of the pieces of the filter, which would have been not only are they active, but they have to be selected currently as a volunteer in that checkbox that says volunteer. So A has to be true, and B has to be true, and C has to be true, and D has to be true. And therefore, we're only going to get the A, B, C, D contacts, not just A, not just AC or ACD or any of the other permutations. It has to be A, B, C, and D. Conversely, what would happen if we replace those AND statements with OR statements? So you needed to be available on Saturday, or you could not be available on Sunday, or your status could be active. Well, can you see how that's going to get? Eventually, it's going to get all of my volunteers because each OR statement is just going to add more and more records to my list. So the only thing that the only people who would not have shown up on this list is someone who wasn't, actually even people who weren't volunteers would show up on this list with that logic. But especially it would give me all of my volunteers, which is not the group that I was trying to go after. I was only specifically going after a small group of people. So that was the volunteer example, and that's sort of what that looks logically. I have a second example that deal with a little bit of this logic, and this is the one where it might get a little bit harder. We're going to be mixing AND and OR statements. And the reason you would mix AND and OR statements is because we're trying to make multiple ways that people can be put on lists. You can be A and B or A and C. Now the problem with when you draw up an equation like this with this A and B or A and C all together, let me just do that on the screen real quick. We have immediately, well, wait a second. Can you be B or A? Or do you need to be B and A? It's ambiguous on which one of these takes precedence. So we therefore have to use parentheses. And you'll see a number of examples and what you get out of each one of those a little further below. So if it's A and B or A and C, then the only possible outcomes for that are AC and ABC. If you change where those parentheses are, you'll get totally different results. All right? So my point is on using parentheses that we are going to be trying to put it in there to make it really clear where that OR statement is. So let me come down to our example that we're going to do next on screen. We're going to be looking at an endowment fund appeal. We want to have a list of everyone who has donated to the endowment fund recently, as well as any big donors that have given in the past. Now I'm going to, just for this demo data we're using, I'm going to use these dates, the 1/1/2009, and call everything after that as recent. And I'm going to say that the big donors amount is 500. And you can see my A and B or A and C with the ambiguity is a problem. So if I put in parentheses, you have to be A, an endowment fund giver, and B, also a person who gave to the endowment fund since 2009. Or you can be an endowment fund giver who gave more than $500 to the endowment fund. All right? So that's the more accurate picture here, that we're doing A and B or A and C in parentheses. But you can simplify these instructions. And if this blows your mind a little bit, it's A and B or C. You have to be giving to the endowment fund, and it's either recently or big. So that's what we're doing here. We're going to be simple. We're going to first do it. Actually, we'll probably just do it with the simplified version because we're running out of time. A and B or C with B or C in parentheses. All right, so back to PastPerfect. So BG, I'm going to create a new list. All right, clicking on OK. Endowment recent or big, we're going to go to add record to, or I'm sorry, yeah, add records to selected list. Hit the down arrow for the field. Go down, and this time I'm not going to be looking in my volunteers or any of the fields that are in the contacts database. I'm going to have to go down to that more specific database the donations table to figure out what donation or what fund we gave to. So the first thing I know, A, is that it has to be the endowment fund. So I'm not going to be actually querying contacts. I'm going to be querying donations. A contact may have given several donations to the endowment fund or none at all. So I'm going to click on donation fund, begins with, and I'll just type in endowment. Now, if you have multiple endowment funds or other funds that begin with the word endowment, then you'd have to be more specific or do contains exact match. But for my database, this is all I need. Click on Add Statement and Run Query to select results. Now, I get 30 people, but I haven't put in any second statement yet. And that is to say that you have to have done this recently. Now, when I did donation begins with, and I hit that down arrow of begins with, I had contains text, contains exact match. But watch what happens now when I start talking about dates and recently. So I'm going to go down to, again, my donations table. So here's my donations date, and it's going to be greater than. And if I want everything since 2009, I can just do, since we were closed the first of the year anyway, everything greater than 1/1/2009, and add to statement. Now, should this be an AND statement? I think so. We're going to click on Add. So now I'm going to run query, and it should be less than 30. And indeed, it's 14. All right, so now I'm going to add another statement, and this is to say, you know what, I also want those big donors, right? So I'm going to do or, because they don't have to give recently if they're big donors. If they gave in 2008, we still want to include them on this list. I'm going to go down to my donation. Amount is greater than. Notice this number has changed. Now I have options for greater than 500. And if I was going to be more accurate about this, I would do 499.99. All right, so I'm going to add the statement. So now I'm going to run query to select my records. And I come up with 31. And I think this is great. I've got this filter statement in there. It all looks super. And I add these records to my list. So I've got the records added to my list. Now let's go check it out. So I'm endowment recent or big. Click on this and then go to the View Records. And here's Richard Hilton. And if I take a look at his donations, I can see, yes, he gave to the endowment fund in 2011. So he should certainly be on this list. Hit the next button, and I come to Mary Parr, and I look, and she's not listed as any of these donations for the endowment fund. So why is she showing up on this list that we created? Well, the answer is it's because we didn't use parentheses. And in this case, she has a $1,000 donation and a $2,500 donation, both of which are getting her on this list because we didn't specify that you have to be both A, endowment fund, and B, over $500. So let's go back and fix that. So back here, I'm going to close out of the endowment fund record view and go back into where I can do my filter, which is endowment fund, recent or big, add records to selected list. Go into here and modify the filter statement. You can see your endowment fund here can't have an empty fund. So there's my AND statement right after that. And my parentheses need to go around this OR statement. So when I click on Edit, at the end of 499, I put a parenthesis. And at the beginning of donation, I put a parenthesis. And then I hit Save. If I exit from here, run query, you'll see my number went from from 31 down to 26. And you'll notice Mary Parr, who was number 2, is no longer showing up on our list. Add records to, contact records to the list, and then click on Yes. And this will put my contacts on a list. Now, one thing I did mess up just there, and you may have seen it, is I did not clear the list first, so it added. So I now have 31 people on this list. If I make that mistake, again, as long as I haven't manually created this list, if I make this mistake, I can simply click on Remove All Records from the List, and then run Query to Select Records, and then add records again, and this time it will create just my 26 records. All right. So I'm going to exit back out, and I now have my Brian Gomez folder with my 3 lists that we've created during this webinar.